Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to the virtual CISO moment. Jonathan Mandell joins us. He is the founder of Teepee. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Excited to hear about your journey. How and why did you get into this wonderful field of information and cybersecurity? And take us through how and why you founded a company.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll start the journey like a lot of people do. When I graduated college in 2007,
Mm-hmm.
it's very funny. I specifically remember I was a senior in college and I went to a job fair and they had all these, big names like Deloitte and Ernst and Young. And, the hot thing to do in 2007 was to go into accounting, to go into finance. And I didn't really have a career, a business track or a career track in college to do that. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then I graduated from college. I didn't get a job, I didn't really even apply that hard to those types of businesses. And so I remember reaching out to a lot of alumni at my university just to understand what they do, what kind of business they were a part of, and see if there's maybe a job opportunity there.
Mm-hmm.
And so after a couple of months of networking and reaching out and talking to people, I ended up getting, back then we would call it a sales assistant job. Now you would maybe call it a sales associate or, something sort of entry level sales. I got a job for a company called Intralinks in New York. And I had a really interesting start to my career where I was on a sales path, which took me all around the world. I moved to Hong Kong. I started out in New York. I moved to Atlanta. And then I actually ended up back in Chicago, which is where I'm originally from.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, I grew into sales. And kind of the funny thing is, now we look around and technology and software sales is everywhere. It's ubiquitous and people have great careers in it. But when I was coming out of college in 2007, it was still kind of in its infancy. And I think sales was probably viewed still like a little bit sleazy, even now today, a tiny bit, but, back then a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really was sort of fascinating to see the field of sales grow, the field of technology grow. I was working for a SaaS company when, SaaS was in its infancy as well. So that's kind of how I started off my career. From there, I knew I wanted to start a business. I knew I wanted to go into entrepreneurship. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I ended up starting to work for smaller technology SaaS companies. And by smaller, going from a company that had 500 to 1,000 employees when I left to 25 to 30 employees. And then eventually I even went to a company that had just a couple of employees. And previous to the last company that just had a couple of employees, which was a cybersecurity company in third-party risk management, I had never been directly in cybersecurity. So there were elements of the companies I had sold for previously that had cybersecurity elements, but the company that I joined, which was called Third Party Trust, was directly involved with third-party risk management, and that's sort of how I started my journey in cybersecurity. So it was a long career of sales and business development and working for small startups, to then joining a small cybersecurity company, which I'll get to how that led me to start Teepee. But that's kind of how I eventually got into cybersecurity.
So having that background and working for the smaller businesses, certainly I'm sure that you did see a lot of opportunities there with regards to threats and issues that even if you weren't in cyber at the time, you were being exposed to it. And I suspect that part of that is what led you to found TP. But let me just ask out the gate, from
Yeah.
your perspective, having seen kind of absorb some of that from the small businesses before, and now with what you've done with TP, what would you think is one of the most significant threats, cybersecurity wise, to small and mid-sized businesses?
Yeah. So depends on the industry, of course. I will say before I even kind of jump further into that, one thing being part of small and medium sized SaaS companies, and really now any business where you are somehow involved in B2B sales, if you're smaller and you service larger customers, you are going to basically be on the receiving end of a security questionnaire.
Absolutely.
And so I would say, like, from a relevance standpoint, I mean, that is something that almost everyone is seeing these days, no matter your size, no matter your relevance, if you are indeed servicing, a large customer, and especially, as you go more regulated financial services. But to answer your other question was, what are some of the threats? I'm really focused on third-party risk management. And so depending on where you are on the spectrum, I often say third-party risk management is a combination of three things. It's a combination of cybersecurity, vendor management, and compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on your size and your industry, you'll have stronger elements of one of those three, but you'll always have a combination of those three. And so if you're a smaller business, it's going to be much more on the vendor management side, meaning who are the vendors we even work with? Do we have a catalog? Do we even know where we're sharing our data, right? Do we even know where the data ownership resides? Do we have a data classification? And do we have a good handle of this data that we're sending out to third parties? Where is it going and what type of data are we sharing? So that's on the smaller end. Then as you go up the spectrum, then it becomes a question of, okay, how do we secure this data? Is it things that we ask of the vendor to mature and put in place and remediate? Is it things that we put in place internally? Is it some combination of the two? And then how do we attest to that from a compliance standpoint, either to show customers, to show auditors, to show regulators?
Well, I know that's a kind of a pain point with small to mid-sized businesses in particular. So we get, as an example, we get these questionnaires. You were talking about questionnaires. We get them. They come in. We're asked to fill these things out. Some of them maybe are 20 questions. Some of them are 1,500 questions. Like if you're doing a full SIG, and they're never consistent. It seems like they'll ask questions in different ways. And it gets to be very difficult, very time consuming, even if you're like the subject matter expert for the organization, to fill out these questionnaires. And of course, the people that are sending them want to have the answer yesterday. So let's talk a little bit. I don't know much about Teepee outside of what I've read a little bit, but how does Teepee fit into all of this?
Yeah. So the last startup that I did sales and business development for was third-party risk management, which was a TPRM platform. Through experiences with my customers and seeing what they were going through, and my customers were assessing vendors and sending out the questionnaires and asking for things like policies and SOC 2 reports. I really thought there was a place for a service like Teepee to be able to assess a vendor like an Okta, like a Twilio, like a Salesforce, assess it for one customer and reuse elements of that assessment. Because it was really frustrating to see how challenging it was for my customers to essentially redo an assessment from scratch over and over and over again, although they were even assessing the same vendors, right? And a lot of times in the same way as well. They weren't differing in how they were assessing. So Teepee was really born out of a idea that, okay, we can actually do a review of these vendors and share some of the resources among the customers. At the same time, it's good for the vendors because in a way, the vendor would only have to respond once to an assessment request. They wouldn't have to continually respond to more and more assessment requests.
So in that sense, it's really like a many-to-one type relationship. So and then I kind of see this as well. For example, I mean, we've got several clients that use Microsoft 365. Well, just within our virtual CISO organization, if we assess that platform once, for one client, then we can replicate that to the other clients as well too. That's sort of what you're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just focusing really on that as a domain expertise. You might have customers where you're not just working in third-party risk management, but that model you just described could pop up and could make itself apparent, which is great that you're able to do that. So TP is really just focusing on third-party risk management with the model that you just said.
So what do you do if you get like a customer that comes in and is looking for an assessment for a vendor that you haven't assessed before?
Yeah, so just it's sort of the same motion that you might do for, I mean, every vendor at one point will be one that you've never assessed before.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll assess that vendor like you would sort of any other customer, but then that analysis and that data you can maintain on an ongoing basis. And a lot of times those customers will want an assessment done annually. So it's not just doing it once, right? It's doing it every year, and then trying to find the overlap among your customers that use that vendor.
So hypothetically, as you continue with the business, your database, if you will, of vendors that you assess on an annual basis should grow, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever get to the point where you realize, nobody's used this vendor or asked for this vendor for 6 years now? I know you're not quite that far along, but do you ever get to the point where you're like, I don't think we're going to assess it this year because nobody's asking for it? Or do you just like do you do the assessment annually when you get a request?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. I'm not just, looking at the top 1,000 vendors and saying, okay, we're going to do an assessment of them. It's only if an existing customer already has that vendor.
And what does your assessment entail? Like if I went to you and I said, vendor X over here, they're a SaaS provider for us. They're doing A, B, and C. Are they any good or not? What can I expect to get back from you?
Yeah. So we've identified 50 controls that, we think are very important to our customers. And so we are looking for evidence of those controls and writing up both an analysis and the source of the data of those controls in documentation the vendor provides. And we're giving a report to our customers across those controls.
Do you have any back and forth with your customers? What I'm thinking is that sometimes, maybe I'm getting a little bit too deep, but I sometimes can geek out with vendor management.
Yeah.
So you get a SOC 2 in, and SOC 2 has many different sections. A lot of folks, they'll just look at the SOC 2 and they'll say, they'll look to see any exceptions. Is it qualified or unqualified? Okay, everything looks good. We're done. Never look at something like, two important things I think that are often overlooked. That is, does the SOC 2 cover the services that we're doing? And are we doing the complementary user entity controls? So do you have like sort of a back and forth to make sure that your client, that the services that the SOC 2 has matches up with your client and that they're actually doing the complementary user, or at least letting them know you need to be doing these?
Yeah, that's part of our deliverable is recommendations. So the deliverable will either be recommendations that you can ask for of the vendor. The vendor has, this misconfigured, or they're not doing this. We really feel like they should be doing this. You should have this in place. You should ask for this to be remediated. So that's one side of the recommendation. The other side of the recommendation is kind of what you just described there, which is like the CEUCs. What can we put in place internally that will, allow us to put zero trust principles first, right? Less data than needed to the vendor, or just, some security controls, MFA, SSO with the vendor, those types of recommendations that will be important to protect the data.
Do you have any sort of, and this may be going a little bit too sideways, but sometimes I like to think like an auditor. And so an auditor says, okay, I see that you've got these reports on your third-party providers, but what have you done yourself to verify that the third-party provider that is providing you, in this case, Teepee, is providing you correct information? Like what kind of due diligence, or if any, do your customers perform on you?
Yeah, I mean, we're a third party, and the customers that we service are of the size that they want detailed reports on vendors. So
Hmm.
they're definitely doing an assessment of us. Um, Now we don't really have that much data, right? We never have any PII, PHI, GLBA, any type of sensitive data like that. So how we're classified to our customers is relatively low compared to some of the vendors that we assess. But we're certainly put through the ringer.
Right. I mean, there's no reason, unless you do have it, but there's no reason for like an organization like you to have your own SOC 2, because you really don't have, as you said, access to the customers or on either side, confidential information. You're basically taking, when in essence, well, I guess you can consider a SOC 2 confidential, but I'm sure you got NDAs in place and all of that. But you're taking something that's kind of like basic information that's meant to be consumed by clients, and then taking the client's data and kind of like matching it all together, so that at the very least, then your client can say, I understand the risk, and here's what we need to do internally to mitigate it.
Yeah,
I think I got it.
exactly. I mean, there's a lot of NDAs that fly around, but at the end of the day, you're right. A SOC 2 is a document that's meant for distribution.
Hmm.
And then, questionnaires, even like the CAIQ, are publicly available, right? They're not even uh, accessible, you don't need an NDA, right? You can just go to the CSA website and download any vendor's CAIQ that chooses to upload it. So a lot of the data is meant to be, consumable, and I wouldn't say is um, actionable as far as intelligence. One thing that I do want to bring up that I think is very interesting is AI is really going to change this industry in the next 5 years. We're seeing it ourselves. We're building technology and tooling to make our teams more efficient. And I mean, I see it sort of every day on social media. I really think generative AI is going to change third party risk management for the better. I think it's going to allow teams to assess more vendors quicker than they're able to do now. And I think it's going to allow vendors to respond to teams much more quickly and efficiently than they ever have before.
Oh, absolutely, because you have like the power to take like all this information is over here. Here are the questions here. Answer the questions for me, whether it be in the cake or whether it be any other questionnaire, standardized the SIG or anything like that. Um, but I can see there still needs to be at least a little bit of oversight with regards to that, to verify. That's one of the things we talk about generative AI. It's just like, trust but verify, I guess, that sort of thing. Do you see that? Um, do you see that being an issue, or do you think that th- these LLMs can be so well trained internally that the answers, you're going to have a confidence rate quite high?
You get a confidence rate quite high. I know for a fact that, like, especially even for OpenAI, you can ask it how creative, if you will, you want it to be with answers. So
Hmm.
if you feed it existing content, um, it can base the answer purely on the content that you feed it. Um, so I'm very, very confident. And the other thing I'll say is, I think generative AI, for sure, in third party risk, probably in the wider economy, it allows knowledge workers to basically have a superpower. So, like, is it going to replace like work? Yes, but I think it's just going to make everyone so much more productive, so much more efficient, that it's going to be net like a huge positive for knowledge workers and office workers. And I see it in third party risk management. So if my analyst can get to one assessment in 3 hours using AI, generative AI, well, now they can get to 3 or 4 assessment in the same time period. So, will I overall need less analysts to do that work? Yeah, but I also am able to do a lot more work much more efficiently, much quicker.
And probably, when all is said and done, much more accurately, because I can say from having done the process manually. I mean, after a while, as you're going through like a long questionnaire or a long SOC 2, if you ever have insomnia, read a long SOC 2, particularly if it covers all of the trust criteria. It's like all 5, I think it is. I
Right.
mean, that can get to be very, very dry reading. So I agree with you with regards to generative AI. It's such a I think the one challenge we have though right now is that there's so much buzzwords associated with it. So separating the buzzwords from what's actually uh, doable with Gen AI, and you're seeing that right now, as you said, on social media.
Yeah, I mean, it's I totally agree with you, by the way. And one of the things I think that came out of crypto is people are very careful about the new thing, right?
Yeah.
Because you do have some of the same signs of a trend or a wave, but for someone that I never really could see the practical uses of crypto. I'm already seeing the practical uses of these LLMs. And I mean, you described it yourself. You said, okay, we have a bucket of data. We get a bunch of questions. Let's answer the questions based on that bucket of data. And I mean, we're even building tooling that does exactly what you just said. Um, and it's not that difficult to do. You don't have to be that technical to do it. So I think these tools are going to be very widespread in short order.
I mean, I just love from the standpoint. I mean, if we back off to like something public like ChatGPT, it's like, previously it's like I go research something. I had a question in my head, and you put that question in, say, like a URL search and all that, and you get all these hits on all these pages. You have to dig through to find out where the answer is. But if you ask generative AI a question, it will do all that parsing through and answering for you. So it's like, I mean, that's just amazing. It's almost as if you're talking with someone. And I love the fact that folks like you and other folks in the field are embracing that and trying to make the process easier, because in the end, it's all about reducing the risk, and in particular in my field, to small and mid-sized businesses. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But none of this comes without some measure of stress. And I know that being in cyber has a lot of stress. Being an entrepreneur has a lot of stress. Particularly, I know in my case, it's like I never planned to be a business owner. I kind of just fell into it, and you learn a lot. Taxes. There's just a lot of things that you learn. It can be stressful, and particularly as you grow your business, and you need to get away from that stress, because we do have a problem in our industry with mental health and burnout, and it's important for people to get away. So one of my favorite questions on this podcast, for those who know, is I like to ask folks, what do you do to decompress, to get away from that stress?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I will say too, and being an entrepreneur, one of the things I will say is it's something you do if you love it. So I mean, I love what I do, right? It's a lot of fun. It's
Hmm.
a lot more fun than when I was sort of employed as an employee. Uh,
Hmm.
it does have some added stress, but I would say, the enthusiasm that you take from loving it really can help you power through and drive through. So that's one thing I'll just say off the bat. Secondly, yeah, to unwind, my wife and I, we love to cook. So we cook probably 5 or 6 days a week, if not all our meals, then at least a couple of meals per day, and we're pretty in depth about it. Um,
What's your favorite meal that you guys cook?
I love to grill various things. I mean, we really cook everything, but one thing I will say, something I do on the side, it's kind of a summer passion of mine, is I love farmers markets. I love going
Uh-huh.
to farmers markets. And actually, a couple summers ago, I started my own little farmers market stand where I sell baked empanadas, baked Argentinian style empanadas. So
Oh,
yeah, every summer, like on Sunday mornings, I have a farmers market stand and I sell these baked empanadas, and it's a fun business, and it really kind of gets me out and doing something I love.
that's awesome. I should say that I haven't had my lunch yet, and I'm kind of hungry. So it's like, and you made a good point. I should go back about entrepreneurship and all that. Those that do it, one of the fundamental pieces of advice is that you do it because you love it. You don't do it because you're, like, say, stuck between jobs, something like that.
Yeah.
You really have to dive into it. And I will say that, as stressful as it is on my side, uh, uh, I could never go back to corporate. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I'm like, and I spent I spent close to 30 years in corporate, and I can't float back into that world anymore once you work for yourself. I mean, do you kind of feel the same way?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I've been doing TP for almost 4 years now, a little bit
Mhm.
under 4 years. And, the beginning's always a challenge, and getting a baseline level of revenue is always a challenge. And so that's probably what, when people want to start a business, and I've heard this from a lot of people, the first, you have to go into it knowing, hey, the first 2 or 3 years, it's going to be lean. It's going to be really lean. Um,
Yes.
and so that is probably one of the things that deters people, as it should. But hopefully, if you can get to sort of that minimum level that sustains you, you're then able to build from that, and then that's when you can really start enjoying it or having fun.
Yeah,
Up,
that's like a flywheel going at that point in
yeah,
time.
up until then, it's just really stressful. It's really difficult, and yeah, you have all sorts of self doubt in your head. But
The
uh,
trough of disappointment.
yeah,
They have that graph about when
right.
you're so excited, and then you're in the middle of the trough, and then you slowly climb out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what future plans do you have, whether it be for you or for TP or both?
Yeah, right now, actually, I'm in the midst of developing some tooling, which is the first that we've ever done. Right, it's always been pure services,
Mhm.
but we see a really good opportunity to build tooling for ourselves and then apply that to other companies in third-party risk management. And so the tooling is all around TPRM and AI, and I'm really excited about it because I see the potential for ourselves, and I think that could add value to others. So that's right now what I'm focused on for the future, and I'm just really excited about.
So if they want to find out more about TP, where do they go?
TPSafe.com.
tpsafe.com. That's easy to remember. Even I don't even I was going to ask you to send it to me, but I can remember that. So,
Yeah.
well, listen, Jonathan, it's been absolutely awesome having you on. Glad to see what you're doing in this very important space. That probably is, I think, one of the biggest risks out there, and very excited to see what you guys continue to produce with regards to your tooling initiatives.
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate it.
Everybody, stay secure.